on electric. Nice, nice. I've traveled a lot in my lifetime, mostly with my family, but every once in a while, with youth groups or even adult groups from time to time, I've been led by a travel guide or a trip leader. And it's nice in a way because depending on where you're going, you know, you get yourself in shape and you buy the right clothes and you pack up the right stuff and you get to the right place at the right time, and then you're kind of done, right? The trip leader has to tell you where to go and when to be there, and they make sure you're going to get fed, and they tell you what to eat and what not to eat in some cases. And it's always fun to watch the face of a trip leader the first time he assembles the group, because he and those of us going on the trip have never laid eyes on each other, right? So he knows it's going to be his job to get this group, whatever it is, from point A to point B, depending or regardless of the weather or whatever the circumstances of the day are. And you can almost see him, you know, wince as he sees us get off the plane or whatever in brand new high heels or with 80 extra pounds. Somebody gets winded coming down the escalator. At that point, though, none of that matters, right? Because the trip leader is stuck with a whole bunch of us, regardless of who we are or what we are. And the only question then at that point is how clever he can be in getting us where we need to be, especially when we're hot and tired and hungry and homesick. Sometimes when the weather is bad and the day holds a lot of walking and very little sitting or eating, and everyone is grumpy and complaining, it's hard to remember that this is something you chose to do and you paid good money for. And you start daydreaming about all the comforts of home, you know, your full refrigerator and your heater or your air conditioner, whichever it is you're longing for, your closet full of clean clothes. And you start to think the next time you do something like this, it's going to be a condo in Malibu. And that's when the trip leader really starts to earn his pay. And then this trip leader usually becomes unbearably cheerful. Isn't this fun? We are on such an adventure. Yay, at least you're not bored. You're not bored, are you? Well, I tell you all this because it's probably as close as I'll ever come to understanding what Moses went through with the chosen ones in the wilderness. Now, granted, a 10-day trek in a foreign country is not 40 years in the wilderness, but Moses was a trip leader all the same, and he had the orneriest bunch of hikers you ever want to know. They whined and cried and criticized his leadership. They wanted better food and more water. They wanted an easier route, and they went and got all nostalgic over the good old days when they were slaves in Egypt. But well-fed slaves. So this is the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament of the Bible. It's the 13th chapter of that book. When Moses is just about through with it all, right? He's tired. He's taken this group a long way for a long time, and he's had enough. The promised land is in their line of vision. God has already told him he can see it, but he will not be going there. So this is his farewell speech to his folks. And he looks at the people who started out, you know, with fresh clothes and new backpacks, standing before him now, clothes in shreds, backpacks hanging by a single strap. And he looks at these once overweight people whose pants are now held up with, you know, pieces of rope around their thin waists. And he lets them know that the time has now come for them to choose. They have to go on and make their own decisions from now on. He's not going to be there to make their choices for them. He's gotten them to their destination. He's taught them everything he knows, and now they must choose, right? Life or death, prosperity or adversity. Moses reviews God's covenant with them and then reminds them of what it will take for them to live. Love God, walk in his ways, observe the commandments. And then he also reminds them of what will kill them, right? Turn away from God, don't listen bow down to other gods and serve them. He's not threatening them exactly. He's just telling them like it is, right? Laying it all out for them, putting it all on the table. It's the way it is. You walk out a second-story window and you're going to fall. You hold your breath long enough and you're going to pass out. You turn away from God and you will perish because only God has the power to sustain life. The chosen people knew that for the most part, but they forgot it a lot. Or maybe more accurately, they hoped it wasn't so, because if God had the only keys to life, then that left them dependent on God, and God's idea of a good time was not their idea of a good time. Take manna, for example, right? It was ingenious for it to fall out of heaven like frosted flakes. It tasted good, but the problem was variety, right? It was manna on Monday, and manna on Tuesday, and manna on Wednesday, and manna on Thursday, manna on Friday, manna on Saturday, manna on Sunday, manna, and more manna. And then there was the water situation. You would have thought that if God was going to move, 600,000 folks to the wilderness for 40 years, he might have chosen a route with some water holes in it, right? But no, they went thirsty till they thought their heads would explode. And none of the chosen children would walk anymore. They just stopped and they threatened Moses with his life if he didn't find some water for them. Finally, he pounded on a rock with his stick and water came out. It was unbelievable, but how hard would it have been, right, to provide a few oases here and there with a few shade trees and some watering holes. And then there was Moses himself. He was a serious guy, as trip leaders go, no sense of humor, pious beyond words. And they were grateful for him, I'm sure. But his expectations of them were very, very high, too high in their opinion. He expected them to be as single-minded as he was, right? To walk on and on and on without complaint, to believe that all of this was God's idea and that God was guiding them on this torturous path. It was all right for him, but they were ordinary people, right? They needed a break. They needed some time to unwind and to let go. So, when Moses went up to Mount Sinai for a couple of weeks, the chosen ones got creative. And they gathered up all the gold jewelry and they melted it down and formed this little golden calf so they could have something to worship. They thought they might have better luck, I think, getting what they wanted from a small portable god, one that they could carry around with them, the pocket-sized version of God. The real God had turned out pretty hard to deal with, right? Hard to handle. So they switched over to this homemade version, the one they made themselves. And it might have gotten them killed too, except Moses did come back from Mount Sinai and he intervened for them. And he ground the calf into gold dust, and then he sent them out on their way once again toward the promised land. But unfortunately, this was just a remission and not a cure, right? Because even today, we still show a marked weakness for our golden calves. And our reason hasn't changed much. God is still hard to deal with. God's ways are still not our ways. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And our comfort doesn't seem to be real high on God's priority list. So we're always fooling around in our little spiritual basements, cooking up some alternative gods that promise to be more responsive to our needs. If you think you don't have any of those alternative gods, then I can suggest a golden calf detector for you. Check your ATM record or your checkbook and see what you invest in the most. What does your check register say about what you worship? Or look at your calendar. What gets the biggest piece of your time? Which is more important, of course, than your money. When it comes to rest or pray or wait upon the Lord, what gets in your way? Whatever it is, that's your golden calf for sure. A job that promises security, a house that promises comfort, a portfolio that promises protection, a relationship that promises safety, a position in the community that promises power or status, a car that promises prestige. All these little golden calves lined up on our mantles, none of them bad in themselves, ever the problem. It's usually a good thing, like gold, made into an ultimate thing, like God. And that's when we get into trouble, because things are not God. They never have been, and they never will be. They might make us feel good for a while. They might produce some good results for a while, maybe a good long while. But talk to someone whose job has just evaporated, or whose house has just been taken away, or whose marriage has just ended, or whose health has just failed, and ask that person just what a golden calf is worth. God, on the other hand, the one true and living God, doesn't seem very interested in producing results, or at least not the kind that interests us. God seems more interested in producing life. And not just the breath and pulse and brainwave kind of life, but abundant life, extravagant life, my cup runneth over life, right? Which has little to do with comfort or security or power or prestige. Yesterday I went to a reception for new Bishop Karen Oliveto and her spouse Robin. And Bishop Brown, who just retired from this conference, was there, and he spoke and he reminded us that the election of Karen as bishop was not the end of our work, but the beginning of our work. It was time to claim who we are and begin living into the church that God is creating. We may be able to see the promised land from where we are, but we aren't there yet. And we have to make some choices now, life or death, prosperity or adversity, blessings or curses. We can't afford anymore to be complacent. We can't afford to be undecided in our life decisions. This is a time to be clear, a time to stand up for justice, a time to stand behind this conference's choice for bishop. We have chosen a lesbian woman, not because she's a lesbian, but because she's a faithful, intelligent, justice-seeking, loving, generous, devoted, pastoral leader in the United Methodist Church. Amen. She's being called, and we recognize her call. She has been chosen, and she has stepped up for a time such as this. And it's time. But this will not be a cakewalk for her. This will be a long and often painful journey in which we will see the very best of our brothers and sisters, and we will also see the very worst as we struggle to define our different theologies and philosophies and address our prejudices and fears. Temple has, in my mind, claimed its identity as an open and welcoming church, both by becoming a reconciling church and also because of the genuine love that you share with each other and everyone who comes in our doors. We have chosen life. It's what we've chosen as a church, and I hope that it's what each of you has chosen in your own lives. There's no more room or time for sitting on the fence. There's no more time for wearing the wrong shoes and using sore feet as an excuse to not follow the risen Christ. A lot of gods will try and wave us down along the way. Charges have already been pressed against Karen. All those things that call our attention away from God, away from living into our call as Christians to love God and love each other, to walk with mercy, to live with kindness, to walk humbly with our God. We can bow down to our homemade gods. We do it all the time. It's one of our choices. We can choose to serve them, or we can stand up and brush that gold dust off our hands and seek the living God, right? Even if the food is not so good and the water's hard to come by and the expectations are ridiculously high. It's our choice. And we make that choice every day. And sometimes every hour. Turn toward the golden calf corral, or turn toward the wide open spaces, the wilderness where the one true God can be found. The choice is ours, and in the words of a famous trip leader, I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life, so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, holding fast to him, for that means life to you and length of days. That's how the passage in Deuteronomy ends. We don't know how the people answered Moses. We don't know what they chose, which leaves that question still hanging in the air for us today. We have been fully informed. Heaven and earth will witness to that. The choice is ours, blessings or curses, life or death. What will it be, people of God? Let us choose this day whom we will serve.